Welcome to our podcast about leisure, work, and well-being, where we explore what we can learn from our experiences engaging with leisure seriously, and from the vast literature on the topic of serious leisure. My name is Petya Petrova. I'm Associate Director of Academic Practice. I'm based at the University of the West of England in Bristol, henceforth referred to as UWE. I'm your host for today's podcast. I'm joined by our regular and extraordinary podcast contributors, Kat Branch, who is leader of the UWE Centre for Music. Welcome, Kat.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Petya.
And of course, we are also joined by Dr. Sam Elkington from Teesside University. Sam is our resident podcast expert and the co-author of the Serious Leisure Perspective book. Welcome, Sam.
Pleasure to be here.
We are very excited to welcome today our two esteemed guests. We have Dr. Richard Waller, who is Associate Professor of the Sociology of Education here at UWE. Welcome, Richard.
Hello, Petya. Thank you very much.
And also here at UWE, we have Jon Dovey, Professor of Screen Media.
Hi, Petya. Good to see everybody. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you and welcome, Jon. Richard and Jon, can you please introduce yourselves to our listeners and tell us something about your professional roles?
Okay, I'll go first. So it's Richard. I've been at UWE for many years. I was actually an undergraduate student at what was then Bristol Polytechnic back in the 1980s. Then I disappeared for a few years and came back as a part-time lecturer in the sociology department, an hourly paid lecturer. And then I did a PhD in what was then the Faculty of Education, which I started in 2001. And I've been here ever since. I'm now associate professor, as you said, and I co-lead our professional doctorate in education and have various other roles in terms of postgrad teaching and my own research.
Thank you, Richard. Jon?
I am a professor of screen media, as you said, because I used to work in the film and television industry and before I was an academic. And then I sort of slithered into academia about 25 years ago and have been teaching film, television, various forms of digital media production and creative work since then. These days, mainly what I do is I'm a kind of project manager for research and innovation programs that put together businesses with academics to do innovation work. So mainly what I do is kind of administer big research projects that have those kinds of funding streams behind them. So a lot of project work, a lot of delivery, a lot of deadlines, and a lot of being busy, especially in this kind of mad Zoom Teams world that we live in at the moment.
Thank you. This is so fascinating. It's always interesting how our professional backdrops, particularly in this podcast, our professional profiles provide a really interesting backdrop to our leisure pursuits, which is what we're going to talk to you about. So both of you have a shared leisure pursuit, and that is fly fishing. And we have had a theme to do with fish and having fish and bubbles in the background. So we are definitely continuing and pursuing with that side of fish-related themes. But it was really interesting if, first of all, you tell us what is fly fishing. Because until I spoke to Richard, I really didn't have any idea that it existed and what it was. And also how you came to be doing fly fishing as a hobby.
Thank you. Well, I would define fly fishing as the art of trying to propel a very tiny piece of fluff into a very large expanse of often moving water in order to trick a wily trout into thinking that it's a beautiful fly that's landed for its lunch and will therefore eat it and allow you to catch the fish. It's about using particular kinds of combinations of fur, feather and hook to produce imitations of terrestrial fly life and aquatic fly life in order to catch fish. And I got into it because I was always into fishing as a kid, really. I was a kind of, fishing was one of those things that as a little boy gave you a license to roam about the countryside with a whole load of lads. And I guess you could say that's probably what I'm still doing. So I used to do it when I was a child, just with worms and maggots and other forms of more easy to access and basic fishing. And then I suppose sometimes in my 40s, I guess, I had a chum who was a bit of a Zen master of fly fishing, and he started talking to me about it. And then I got interested and bought some lessons actually for a birthday. And since then I've been doing it quite a lot, I guess. It's become a major bit of my life, yes, over the last 15 or 20 years.
Thank you for this, Jon. I think this is so fascinating how we keep coming to this theme about incidental engagement, but also some history somewhere in our past that brings that in. Richard, how did you engage with or come to do fly fishing? And also, do you want to add anything to Jon's description of fly fishing?
No, I think Jon generally gave a really good description. I think one thing that differentiates it from other fishing, which non-fisher people may not have picked up there, is the fact you don't use real bait. In a sense, you don't use things like worms and maggots or squid if you're fishing in the sea and things like that. It is all artificial lures, as they're known, hooks that are covered in bits of fluff and feather and foam and things like that, as Jon said, to try and fool the trout usually, although it can be fly fishing takes place for other species as well. It's also the main source of fishing for salmon, for sport, and a few other fish in the UK. Some people do sea fishing with fly fishing, but there's not much of that in the UK. But in some of the tropics, there is a kind of fairly popular sport there. Similar to Jon, I used to fish as a kid throughout my teens, and I used to fish in the sea as well, near where I grew up in Essex, as well as in some lakes with some friends. And as Jon said, it's a good way to hang around with friends. And as he said, in a sense, we're still doing that. Jon and I met effectively through a mutual love of fly fishing, and we go fishing together along with some other people. So that social aspect to it is very important, as well, as I think we'll come on to explore. I started fly fishing. I was introduced to it by one of my neighbours about 10 years ago. He and I and another group of friends were on a boat sea fishing, and he said he mentioned the fact he goes fly fishing and has done since he was 4 or 5 years old. His father used to go, and he invited me along, and I went along with him to Chew Reservoir, which is not too far from where we live in Bristol, and is one of the best places in the country. And I had a go at it, and I fell in love with it, really. And it's been a kind of fairly consuming hobby I've had, leisure activity, for the last 10 years or so. I think it's something I can't imagine not doing now.
It's interesting use of words that you just had there, Richard. Fell in love with it. And my question is why? And how would you fall in love with fly fishing?
A combination of things. It's partly social. As Jon said, we're often either in moving water, so fishing in rivers and wading and so on, and you're very much with nature, and you need to take an awareness of what's going on in terms of the insects that are hatching, because part of what you do when you're river fishing particularly is try and what's known as match the hatch, whereby you find a fly that looks like the sort of food items that are hatching under those conditions that time of year and so on. You're also inevitably going to see lots of other wildlife as well. There's always birds around, and kingfishers and heron and some birds that we associate with the water. We often see mammals, see otters, when we're fishing, which is a mixed blessing. It doesn't mean the fishing's going to be great, but I guess it shows there's something in there. And you see, voles and deer and things like that. And that's part of it, but it's also part of being with friends and having this kind of common interest. But it's a very active form of fishing as well. Some forms of fishing, coarse fishing as it's known, freshwater fishing, often involve sitting still and looking at a float or at the end of your rod tip for movement, whereas fly fishing, you're constantly active. You can't do it without concentrating on it, in a sense. And it's very mindful in that regard. And it's probably the only thing I can spend hours and hours and hours doing without thinking about checking emails or things like that. It's all absorbing, really. And I find that very appealing as well.
Thank you, Richard. I wonder if Jon's experience of fly fishing and that mindfulness is also the appeal for him. So why fly fishing, Jon, and what's the appeal for you?
One of the reasons that I adore fly fishing is its aesthetics, actually. And by that, I mean, it's not the most efficient way of catching fish or indeed of doing anything. It's a kind of mad thing to do in a way, because you've got this tiny bit of fluff that you've got to propel onto the water. And that requires a particular kind of arrangement of physical materials, a particular kind of rod, a particular kind of line, very particular kind of locations. And learning how to cast is a really challenging and quite difficult physical disposition of a skill that you need to learn, a bit like trying to have a perfect golf swing or a great tennis stroke or something like that. It requires a combination of mind, body and physical materials. And the moment of actually getting your special line in the air behind you and kind of propelling it forward onto the water in a perfect cast, where the line just kisses the water and the fly falls in exactly the right place on the flow and travels down, and you see a fish come up out of the water to take it, is just a very beautiful, for me, aesthetic experience, actually. So a lot of it is about certain kinds of style, I suppose, rather than efficiency. And I think that's true of a lot of games and sports, right? I mean, a lot of games and sports have inefficiencies built into them that are designed to make it beautiful in some kind of a way. Just look at cricket. It's a completely ridiculous game, but people find all sorts of pleasures out of the fact that it's constrained by this very particular set of rules that make it aesthetically pleasing to the people that enjoy that kind of thing. So a lot of it's to do with that for me. And I guess the second thing that I'd say about it is really just to amplify what Rich said, you know, that actually that sense of putting on your waders and stepping into a river and walking into a river up to your waist, which in fact is something that is a childlike pleasure that never goes away. It's like putting on your wellies and stepping into a puddle, except it's just at a bigger scale. You get to the middle of the river, you are in somebody else's domain. You're in the realm of the river gods at this point, and you have to really absorb yourself into the landscape and try to sort of feel your way into it. You have to be reading the river, thinking about the insects, thinking about the weather, the wind direction, what the sun's doing. So you just become completely absorbed in this flow state, I would call it, really. And that's what I love, is being able to get into that state and let 2 or 3 hours pass without even noticing that the time has gone by.
You describe it so beautifully. It's amazing. And I think that there's so many parallels with what we've already discussed, but I also think of what we might come to discuss next. And I think Kat would be interested in that idea of artistry that you describe. And I'm sure that Sam has so many parallels to draw here around serious leisure and the involvement and the social aspect of it, as well as the flow state that Jonathan just described. So my question really is to our regular podcast contributors, Kat and Sam, who wants to come in next here in this conversation?
Yeah, I was really captivated by your description, Jon, of the experience of fly fishing and the description of flow state. But actually, what particularly resonated with me was this kind of passion and enjoyment that permeated your description, which I have to say really reminded me of the kind of experiences I might have in music at different times, and that complete immersing within a process and enjoyment of the aesthetic and a complete engagement in the present moment. I think, though, as a musician, I feel like it's a long journey to develop the skill, that aesthetic that I'm aiming for, and also to be able to operate the different tools that I might be using in such a way that flow state becomes accessible to me. I'd love to know, Jon, from your perspective, and also Rich, perhaps from yourself, how it is that you have kept committed to something actually that has this artistry, that has these constraints that you've talked about. It's quite difficult, it's deliberately challenging. What is it that has kept you on that journey to get to where you've got to? And what was that journey from being a novice at fly fishing to where you've reached now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think perhaps that part of what keeps you on the journey is the drive to have a different kind of time, life experience in amongst all of the sort of pressures and stresses of contemporary life, that actually being able to carve out, I don't know, 12 or 20 days a year, which I guess is probably what I put into it, somewhere between that, around about a dozen days a year, 20 days a year, to actually take this kind of time out. So I'm driven for a different kind of time. And then once you accept that there's an activity that can give you that, those peak moments of perfection they might happen like 3 times a season. So you're constantly like looking for that moment and trying to reach those kinds of perfect moments, because all sorts of things go wrong. You know, flies get caught in a tree and they get tangled around your head and you fall over in the water, and very often you catch nothing. There are no fish there, or it rains. You know, all sorts of things go wrong. So pursuit of the perfect moment, I think, is one of the things that keeps me going. I mean, you just learn that stuff as you go along from people. We teach each other. I mean, there are professional things you can do to learn. I've learned it as a social thing, really. And I'm still not very good. I mean, 15 years in, I wouldn't say I was a particularly brilliant fly fisherman compared to some of the people that I see on the river. I always feel as though there's an endless amount to learn. It's an infinite field, actually. You will never know all the things that you could know. I don't know what you think about that, Rich.
Yeah, I agree. There's, as you say, there's always so much to learn. Obviously, nowadays you can watch YouTube clips and so on and so forth and get envious about just how well people can do certain things. A couple of things there, as John said, you don't always catch, but that doesn't mean you don't enjoy it. You know, there's fishing isn't catching in a sense, and you can still have an enjoyable day even without catching, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but it's true. And the idea of time as well, as John said, you know, it's about investing time and seeing an improvement. And you move from a kind of trying to cast incredibly difficult initially, and you move from conscious incompetence to sort of unconscious expert, or that kind of fourth stage of development. And now, you know, we could be standing there talking and both casting and doing it really well. When you start learning it, it's really difficult because it is about the kind of biomechanics of it. I think it's a real challenge to learn. I'm quite like John, really. I'm quite kind of evangelical about it. I try to encourage friends to go and to make sure they have fun. And I've introduced a few people to it, certainly. And if I'm out fishing with someone who's a total novice, like John, I wouldn't set myself up to be an expert. You know, I'm reasonably good now, but I can certainly improve and hope that I will. But if I'm fishing with someone else, I'll always kind of offer advice and hand my rod over if I catch a fish and they've never landed one, and let them catch it if I've got one on the end, and so on. And it's like that. The whole sport, people are very facilitative. They help one another, and there's a real enthusiasm for it amongst people. I think in terms of time, it can be very relaxing. It is generally very relaxing. There's loads of books about fishing, as there are on many sports. I know there's one book by Ian Botham, I think, who isn't necessarily an author I'd go to very regularly, but he talked about how a day spent fishing is a day added to the end of your life. In other words, you know, it doesn't cost you anything. It's not a wasted day. You relax so much, there's almost a kind of nil cost. And I find that a really nice idea. And like John, I do use a fair chunk of my annual leave and weekends on fishing and related things. And that's something that's certainly grown. I played football and a few other sports up to my kind of early 40s, really. And I took quite a bit of time doing that. I wouldn't have time to fit everything in now, but fishing is, in a sense, my kind of number one participating leisure activity.
Thank you both. I continue to be fascinated by the entire pursuit and how you talk about it and the experiences that you have around that. I was wondering if Sam can maybe come in and unpack the description of fly fishing as a hobbyist pursuit, but also the benefits that Richard and John describe and how this fits with the serious leisure perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Betty. How long have we got? I mean, there was so much in there, and I just love how eloquently you're both speaking about the activity. It is clearly a passion, and it was interesting, Richard, when you started talking at the very at the top of the conversation. You subconsciously called it a hobby, which is quite interesting because when we look at the serious leisure perspective and the three kind of component parts to that, we've got the amateur pursuits, the hobbyist pursuits, and the volunteer pursuits. And this certainly, in the way that you've been describing your experiences of fly fishing, falls within the hobbyist aspect of the framework. And what do we mean by that? Well, it's activity participation. You know, there's a core activity there, and the activity itself, it's about, there's a fulfillment to that. It requires an extensive gathering and development of knowledge and skills, technique within that, and certainly practice. And there's parallels to be drawn between sport and games, as John has already brought in terms of, there being maybe a looser, but certainly there's a rule-bound nature to the activity. And that's very much dependent on, the social world that you find yourselves in within that particular activity, what's accepted, what's not accepted in terms of that practice. So in terms of positioning it within serious leisure, or within the perspective of serious leisure, it's certainly a hobbyist activity. But there's so much more within that. I mean, I've been making some notes, so forgive me if I'm just making some sense of this, because there's a couple of things I want to draw out. The first thing, and this is kind of a personal interest as well. My research is on serious leisure, yes, and it has been on the experience of flow within serious leisure. So that piqued my interest. But actually, when we look at what's been written about the serious leisure perspective, one of the unique and durable benefits of a serious leisure pursuit is the thrill and the flow of the core activity itself. And John, you've been very eloquent and descriptive there in terms of your own experience. And Richard, I can hear it in how you're talking there as well, in terms of the skill challenge of the whole thing. And, actually the way you put it, John, was about pursuit of the perfect moment. And, that's what draws you back, for those 12 to 20 days a year. That's what draws you back. And actually, the fact that you don't catch anything is neither here nor there. It's actually the pursuit of that particular moment. And I really, really like that. The aesthetics of that. So there's a performance component to this, which is uniquely personal to you. It's and there's aspects of bodily practice in there as well, because it's a very physical thing, isn't it? And you talked about being connected to nature, and this is where I wanted to kind of draw a question out, because there's actually two aspects to this. So in the perspective itself, we talk about nature challenge, and you can imagine the kind of activities that might be involved there: rock climbing, skiing. You can imagine it, but within the way you've been describing it, the core activity here, there's an aspect of escaping to nature, but there's also an aspect of being connected to nature. And you were talking about wading in up to your waist. You're in nature. You're now immersed in nature, and that's part of the whole experience. I wonder what it is about that particular aspect you find so appealing. And whether that is in fact a conscious thing in terms of when you think about your work practices. Is that something you have actively sought out?
I think so. I think I've always enjoyed nature, and in some ways, in fishing, there's a contradiction, the heart of the dilemma in a sense. There are concerns. People have concerns about cruelty to animals, to fish, particularly. Generally, we do everything we can to avoid harm to fish. Barbless hooks, try and avoid touching them. You keep them in the water to unhook them if you can, and so on and so forth. Obviously, there's no, since we don't use bait, there's no kind of aspects of cruelty there. There's a whole thing around, making sure everything's clean and tidy and you don't leave litter and so on and so forth. And in terms of pollution and everything, fisher people and so on have been at the heart of trying to drive the cleaning up of rivers and for the environmental benefit for everyone, and campaigning against slurry flows coming off of fields and polluting rivers and so on and so forth. And for me, the enjoyment of nature and the natural world is very much part of it. I live in the city. I enjoy living in a city, but I also enjoy getting out of the city, and I enjoy being surrounded by water. I think various people have talked about well-being and the idea of how it can be connected to water. And I think in some ways that's been thrown into sharp relief by the COVID pandemic. I certainly found our ability to go fishing, which we couldn't during the first lockdown until about the middle of May. And I went on the first day we could, and then I went again a couple of days after that because I kind of missed it so much. And for me, it really was about getting out. If I remember, I didn't catch anything either time, but I still had a great time. And being out in nature is very important to me. This is a good focal point for it. And I think the appeal of fishing, it's always had a presence in the media. And quite recently, there's been a TV series with Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse about fishing. And I know people, my partner and partners of several of my friends who really enjoy fishing, my partner wouldn't dream of going fishing. She's got zero interest in it, but she loves that show. And that show is as much about friendship and relationships, but it's also about being there and being in nature and seeing what's going on and so on. And for me, I think that show comes across and portrays fishing really nicely. There are fishing programs which are very macho, and it's, like there's one called River Monsters with Jeremy Wade, and there's extreme fishing and things like that. And this is very much about catching the biggest fish and all the rest of it. But certainly the type of fishing I do and the social benefits and the kind of benefits of nature that I feel I get from it are far more akin to Mortimer and Whitehouse than the rest of those TV shows.
I'm absolutely fascinated, Rich, by your emphasis on the social aspect, friendship and relationships, and the being in nature. Because in fact, on our previous episode, we were talking about social prescribing. I don't know if you're familiar with this particular approach and the way that this actually overlaps a lot with discussions about leisure, because what social prescribing does is it formalizes the sort of interfacing of somebody with a health service and then onto a leisure activity effectively, but in a very deliberate way. And so it provides a mechanism to enable someone to address their well-being situation, by taking up a type of leisure activity. And very interestingly, the main goals of those types of activities, because they can be anything, although I've never heard of fishing being one, but as I'm hearing you, I'm thinking, wow, that would be an incredible opportunity, because the focus is to provide a context for that social connection, that friendship, and then very often to do things like do something physical in the way that helps us feel better, and also to connect with nature. It's really interesting because actually I think as a non-fishing person, I would have always have thought about fishing as a very specialist activity that had a very specialist reason why people would be involved in that type of sport. And in fact, as I'm hearing you speak, it's interesting to see that there's a universality, I think, to what draws us to things and why we might consider them, to be beneficial. And why obviously you're dedicating your annual leave to this activity in that way. It makes perfect sense to me. I did wonder if I could just change tack slightly. Both of you described your jobs at the beginning of this episode. If you just led with that and then asked us as a group to guess what your leisure activities would be, I would eat a hat if anyone would have said fly fishing from your professional setting. Now, by contrast, when people look at my job with the Centre for Music, it's not implausible that much of my serious leisure fits into that. I wonder, do either of you feel as if it was a deliberate gesture to have a space that is completely separate from your expertise and working identity? Was that a kind of deliberate thing? Was it accidental? Or I'm just so fascinated by the total non-relationship between these two things. And I wondered as well whether that in fact is part of what makes it such a benefit to you. I'd love to hear more about that.
That's an interesting question and quite a funny one. I mean, I'm pretty used to my cool young media colleagues regarding me as an utter loser for being into fishing. That, of course, would have been quite uncomfortable if I was 30 or 35. But actually, given that I'm 60 or 65, I don't give a toss. So I'm really happy to be regarded in that way and having this weird other thing that I do that is a silly old bloke kind of thing to get into. So yeah, that is interesting. I never thought about that. It certainly doesn't quite fit the image. So you might be surprised. There's some pretty cool stuff going on around fly fishing. Fly fishing has become a proper hipster thing in America in the last few years, right? So once in a while I'll be cool again.
I agree. I think that the public image of fly fishing, there's perhaps some of the listeners, if not all of us here, will remember a TV advert for Yellow Pages, the old telephone directory, and it was J.R. Hartley, some well-spoken old boy who'd written this book about fly fishing and so on. And there is this image that it's done by the kind of upper middle class old men. And certainly those people are still in fly fishing, but they tend to join exclusive clubs and they tend to join, in a sense, they wouldn't allow the likes of myself and Jon into those clubs, even if we wanted to pay the ridiculous fees they charge to keep people like us out. But as Jon said, there is a kind of younger aspect to it. Yes, it is still aged and classed and raced and gendered and so on. And certainly in terms of my day job, I'm interested in social justice and things of that nature. That, again, I can see this playing out and I can see social class being lived out and type of fishing people do. But as Jon said, there is a kind of cooler hipster side of it. In the US, there's a kind of crowd of young people who go snowboarding in the winter and fly fishing in the summer. There's a kind of jazz thing as well that's going on. There's these Scandinavian jazz musicians who are all into fly fishing and they travel around different parts of Denmark and Sweden and Norway and so on. And there's also a kind of anti-establishment aspect to it even. There's a website called Fly Punk, which sounds a bit daft. And it's about people who don't see themselves as part of that kind of old boys club type thing, but they really still enjoy fly fishing for the reasons we've talked about. And they may be people who, if you saw them in the street, and they've tattoos and they're certain age demographic or whatever, you wouldn't guess that they're fly fishers, but in fact they are. I know about half a dozen at UWE. I won't name check them all now, but as well as Jon, who I was introduced to Jon through a colleague of mine who's a mutual friend of myself and Jon, because he knew Jon fly fished and I did. And he said, well, why don't you guys get together and go, and we did and so on. But there are other people. I've been in meetings at UWE with some senior staff as well, wearing a little lapel badge of a fishing fly. And it's been spotted by someone and said, oh, you're a fly fisherman as well. So we don't all wear our heart on our sleeves in a sense, but there are quite a few of us about.
I was just thinking, Sam, actually, this links us back again to this series, some of the concepts in serious leisure, doesn't it? Because it's where there's a pursuit which has these specific, indicators where people who are involved in that specific activity will know and would clock them and would be kind of part of that community, but in an almost kind of secret way, not deliberately secret, but I mean to say, if you don't have the expertise and if you're not involved in that community, then you won't recognize it. You won't know the language, and you perhaps wouldn't know about these different expressions that you've described about what it is and know who's who and who fits in where. I wonder, Sam, if you wanted to dive in on that.
Yeah, I'm fascinated listening, and it's actually what it is. It's a description of the key features of serious leisure, isn't it? And I'm sat here going, well, I don't really need to say anything. It's all there. What we're talking to specifically here is this aspect of there being a unique ethos to that particular social world. Yeah. So a sense of community, however sprawling that might be, a sense of belonging, attachment, and how that then is portrayed in sometimes how we dress, certain ways of dressing, certain ways of behaving. Richard, you're talking there about connecting with others through that mutual appreciation of that particular core pursuit. That sense of community plays out, doesn't it? But that unique ethos as well, it's multifaceted, and I'm sure if we had a broader sample, if you like, of fly fisher people, but I'm sure they'd have similar experience in terms of how they describe the experience, what draws them in. We'd have facets of similarity there, but certainly what we would see and what we're hearing now between Jon and Richard is that the articulation of that unique ethos and how that social world has certain characteristics, and I know that differs depending on I know there's clubs, and you say you pay membership fees to be part of that particular, and then those particular clubs themselves have a certain etiquette and behavioural code of conduct. So again, that kind of rule bounds. So I find that really, really interesting in how they might differ from club to club, for example. So that sense of attachment and belonging, it's nuanced as well.
Well, this leads me to my question. If a person, man or a woman, wants to get into fly fishing, how do you get into it? It very much sounded when Richard talked about that he had some history in it, but he also in effect contacted with an experienced other, in this case Jon, who kind of brought him into the community. I'm just really interested into that threshold of engaging with, feeling at home with, and obviously developing the practice and the expertise. But how do you move from, I'm interested in this, to I'm now inside the circle?
There are places that you can go where you can get lessons, right? So Bristol Water, actually, the water that we all drink, also houses many, many trout out there in Chumagna and Blagden. They used to run lessons, which is where I first learnt to cast. And so then you meet a few people and you start chatting and you start picking things up. And then in my case, I already had a friend who used to bring me as a guest into these club waters that I had no access to. And then I put my name on the waiting list to become a member of that club. I passed an unofficial kind of ritual test one day on the riverbank when I met one of the people that run the club, and we were chatting away, and he said, "Do you want to be on the waiting list?" I said, "I'd love to be on the waiting list." He said, "Okay, well, that's fine." He said, "I can tell from the flies that are on your fly patch on your jacket that you'll be a good member of the club." So I wouldn't like to sort of give the impression it's a homogenous world. Actually, the world of fly fishing is, of course, like any other social activity, very contested. It's different between England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland. It's different between the north and the south. And all these little communities have their own systems and their own ways of behaving and their own ethics and their own approaches to ecology and fishing and inclusion and membership and all sorts of things like that. So there's a lot of specificity in each of those little subcultures. And I suppose, like anything else, you sort of seek people out and you look for the secret handshake and you look for the lapel badge and you start to find people, and then you start to go out fishing with them, and then you learn, and then after over a period of 10 years, maybe if you're lucky, you build up a small community of people that you hang out with. The clubs are really important, I think. Once you become part of a club, that gives you a lot of access to social, to information, to intelligence, to training in an unofficial way. I think so. The clubs are really the sort of, like in a lot of serious leisure activities, clubs are the kind of lifeblood of the social system, I would say.
Yeah, I'd agree. We choose to join certain sorts of clubs. Now, I couldn't necessarily afford some of the dearer ones anyway, but, it's that kind of Groucho Marx thing. And would you be a member of a club that would have you or whatever? But there's, a club where Jon and I are members down in Wiltshire, it costs, it's a couple of £100 a year. So it's not dead cheap, but it's not prohibitively expensive. But there is the adjoining strip of water to the part of one of the rivers that we're allowed to fish. There's the bridge across the water, and we own, if you like, our club owns part of the water up to the bridge, then another club owns it after that. Now, instead of paying a couple of £100, the people who fish the other side of the bridge pay a couple of £1,000. So it becomes incredibly exclusive. I wouldn't dream of spending that sort of money to join a fishing club, but even if I could afford to, which I can't, and certainly within my family, such a decision would be very unpopular. people join those clubs to be exclusive and to avoid having to fish with others who they don't necessarily have an affinity with, perhaps. And there is a kind of notion of identity politics around this, different people. And as well as things like the cognoscenti, the people know when you talk about certain types of fly fishing, as indeed with other hobbies and leisure activities, the people in the know will pick up the clues. They've got the kind of cultural capital, if you like, to understand what it is you're talking about and the type of fishing you do and your preferred method. You can fish using things that don't really look like natural food for the fish. So you can have bits of pink fluff and things like that, which for some reason provokes a kind of trigger response and the fish attack it, and then you can catch the fish that way. But for many people who are real purists, they wouldn't dream of catching a fish like that, even if even though it may be more effective. You have to do it the kind of proper way. It's against the spirit of it. They'd rather not catch fish at all, or rather not fish if that was the only way to fish. And that's interesting. And I know the way fly fishing developed is it became popularized in Victorian times by the kind of upper middle class gentlemen generally. I'm not an expert on serious leisure, but I know there's a notion of otium, which is that idea of improving recreational activity, sort of intellectually beneficial and so on. So people started fishing and they chose a way to fish that is quite difficult, and that itself perhaps excludes others. But it set apart these Victorian gentlemen from regular folks who maybe would fish as a source of food. So they'd choose to fish the most productive and efficient way. So they'd use barbed hooks, for instance, which certainly John and I don't use now. Fish are, you're more likely to catch a fish if it bites a barbed hook. It's harder to get it out to slip off. So there's a difference between that kind of pursuit as a kind of idealized aesthetic than just doing it solely to catch. Earlier on, you talked about wellbeing and prescribing and so on, and social prescribing, and that is going on apparently. I don't have the details with me. I know there's an academic researcher, I think it's a woman from University of East Anglia, who talks about the benefits of this mental well-being and so on, particularly on young people. And there are various charities. There's a body that's called Fly Fishing for Heroes who work with war veterans, for instance, and take them out. And so you can kind of volunteer to go fishing with someone who's a war veteran or whatever, or people with different forms of disability and so on. You can adapt the boats and everything if you're fishing on a lake. Or disadvantaged children. Again, there's charities that take disadvantaged, often inner city kids out to countryside and in a sense teach them to fish, which also presumably will be accompanied by a growing appreciation of nature and the interrelationship of nature and ecology and so on. So it is recognized, but perhaps the potential for social prescribing and so on hasn't been fulfilled just yet. But I believe that's the kind of direction of travel we're on.
That's fascinating. I wasn't aware of that, Rich. I'll go and look at that, because hearing your descriptions, it then suddenly seemed like such an obvious choice and a way of using fly fishing as an intervention,
Yeah, sure.
Some really interesting comments there. Now, I'm just wary of time, and I also want to bring in another comparison here. And John, I wonder whether you want to come in on this one around, what I'm hearing in the wonderful, eloquent description of the art and experience of fly fishing. Is this idea of, it's storied, isn't it? It's storied. You both have a history, you both have a story. And in the serious leisure context, what you have yourselves is this idea of a leisure career in the activity itself, and that trajectory of from novice to expert, neither of you would probably class yourselves as an expert, but in terms of that mastery of the core activity and the technique and the pursuit of that perfect moment and performance. And I just wonder how that career, your leisure career, compares to your work careers. And I really, 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 really find this interesting. And I'm laughing because, Richard, you're so eloquent in how you unpick it. And I'm just sat here thinking, of course he is. He's a sociologist. So it's,
yeah.
But in terms, I'm just interested, what is it you don't get in your work career that you get in your leisure career, for example, and vice versa? But I'm more interested in that bit. So this idea of career is certainly coming out. What's the point of difference for you?
Peace and quiet is the main difference, man. I do 3 things for work. I talk and I read and I write. Those are the basic activities. They're all very cerebral. There's a lot of chatting and a lot of pressure and a lot of negotiation and a lot of persuasion and a lot of face-to-face, person-to-person tussling with trying to make things happen in the world. And it's great. It's something that I certainly wouldn't claim that I have any mastery of. I think I'm sort of comfortable with doing it. in a way, it's the absolute opposite. It's like a mirror image, because it's peace and quiet. It's being with myself. It's not having to front up. It's not having to impress anybody. It's not having to sell anything. It's not having to persuade anybody. It's not having to pull anybody up on a deadline that's been missed, or even having to have really strenuous conversations with a student on 57 trying to get them to have a 62. It's none of that stuff. It's just being with myself and being in nature and being quiet. So in terms of the parallel trajectory, I mean, I think for me, I wouldn't have had time to even have any space to think about this. When my children were small and I was getting my career together and I was working out how all that worked, I mean, there were 20 years where this was completely irrelevant. So it's interesting to me that some guys will carry on playing football all through that time, or cricket, or running, or climbing, or they'll have a sport or something that they do that's outside of the family. I never really had that. So I didn't really discover it again until I had the leisure time in my life to find it. And also, I did have a health event. I had a slip disc. I was a head of department. It was a really clear message. What happens when you carry too much weight? Oh, your back gives out. Okay, you better start sorting your life out, John, because otherwise this is not good. So that was another point in my life where I started looking actively for a different way of being and other things in my life that would actually balance out my career, actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably not a huge amount I can add to that. I think John's put it really well. At the moment, I think through the COVID pandemic, obviously we're spending even longer indoors. And, certainly myself and John and probably most of the people listening here are spending nearly all of their time in their own house. And I think the joy of actually getting out and getting near water and being able to indulge in the pursuits that we choose to, I think is a real pleasure. We've been fortunate in that fishing of all sorts, but for us, fly fishing has been classified as an exercise, and you're allowed to take it as part of your daily exercise as long as you stay local. So that means we're able to go within, a certain geographical distance and so on. And I think I've appreciated it more when I've not been able to get out as much, if you like. There's the social aspect, and again, there's been times when you've been able to meet in small groups or just one other person and so on. So I've fished with one other friend when we've been allowed to meet one other person outside and so on. In terms of career, yeah, I think like John, I couldn't. Again, it's not prohibitively expensive for people on professional salaries as we are. But I certainly couldn't have afforded to do this when I was young, when I was fishing with friends as a kid, unless I had someone who could loan me all the kit because I couldn't buy it. Whereas now I have a bit more disposable income. I have more time. As I say, I used to play football and things, but I now do gentler activities following various injuries and things, meaning I can't play football any longer. And so my kind of fly fishing career is something if you put it in that term, I think is something I'm keen to develop. And I can see I'm not quite as old as John, I'm in my mid-50s, but I can imagine this is something that I will be doing until I'm no longer physically able to. It's certainly something I want to do as and when I come to retire, just as it's something I do sometimes at weekends or on leisure days, annual leave days, or through going away for weekends even. And part of going away for the weekends, coming back to the social aspect, there's a place I go with some friends sometimes where 6 of us go, up to 6, and there's a sort of cabin by the side of a lake, and it's sort of a private lake, and so you hire it for the weekend and so on. And we spend longer not fishing in that we're sitting around the fire and having a few drinks and so on and talking about stuff. And that is really difficult to imagine replacing with anything else equivalent. So, that side of it, I can imagine, again, doing a long time to come. I think another aspect of it, which we haven't really touched on, is that compared to other sports, it's incredibly democratic. There are some people who are international fly fishermen, using a gender term there, who I've fished with, simply because you can. One of the professionals who are based at Bristol Waters, as John said, Chew and Blagdon and so on, is the most capped international fly fisherman in England. And you can share a boat with him for a couple of hours or something as part of his kind of giving back to the sport. And there's no way, I'm mad keen on football, but I can't imagine I can just phone up an international class footballer and ask for help or advice, or never mind get to meet them. So you can learn from people, and people are keen and willing to give you the time and to pass on their enthusiasm. And that's certainly been something, as I said earlier in the show, something I'm keen to do. I've encouraged friends my age who used to fish when they were kids and haven't done so for ages, who I've kind of persuaded in a sense to give fly fishing a go. And as John said, you can start by going to a club, but the easiest way in a sense is find someone else who does it already, who's prepared, who has some spare kit who show you the basics. And in a sense, that's what I started doing with one of my neighbours, Justin, about 10 years ago. I mainly fished on lakes. I did some river fishing, but Jon was someone who helped with that as well. I'm now a member of the club he was talking about. I was also on the waiting list for several years, and I went there with Jon and a few other people as a guest and really got into river fishing. And I think that's the one I like the most because it is partly so immersive into nature, and that awareness of the natural world is absolutely staring you in the face.
I think this is so fascinating, and I knew we could talk about this forever. And I also, when Richard and I initially talked about this topic of the podcast, he said, you can actually do an entire podcast series on fly fishing, and I can see why, and I can see how you can absolutely do that. What I find fascinating to kind of conclude our discussion with is how particularly our final comments really link to the origin of this podcast about looking for leisure pursuits that is so distinct and different to your day job, that you enrich your life in a different way, but you escape the day job and the normal, and being stuck at home and being outside and all those parallels. So and all the other things that we talked about. And I'm also quite intrigued by, for regular listeners, I've spoken about how a health event can lead you to a leisure pursuit. So sometimes we need that wake-up call if we don't have the history and the habits of engaging with a regular leisure pursuit. Like, for example, Richard has obviously done that with his football play, and how for Jonathan there was definitely a spur as a result of that. And the entire ethos of this podcast is that we don't all have to wait for that health event to hit us before we really reconsider our own well-being and our own leisure and enriching our lives. So I think this is a great point to end this podcast on. I would like to thank the four of you tremendously for this fascinating discussion. So thank you so much to Jon Dovey, to Richard Waller, to Kat Branch, and to Sam Elkington. I would also like to thank Julia Denman, who is expertly recording this in the background, and to our newest podcast team member, Helga Ganostadir, who is going to help us with the editing of this recording and hopefully sort out all the little bloopers we've had as this conversation progressed. There is more to come. Keep listening up. There will be more podcasts. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye, everyone.